that is currently fucked up, and we are going to try to rebuild Dave Tate. You know, over the years, trashing the body, doing world-class things under the bar, it takes its toll. Dave's dealing with some big orthopedic issues, and after going through some of his medical history, some of his training history, and his current training status, we have some work to do. That's why I'm here at the Elite FTS headquarters, and we're going to be spending an entire day assessing, evaluating, and getting a game plan to move Dave Tate forward. To start off this 6-phase sequence for the lower body day, we're going to be doing foam rolling for the quads, most specifically the rectus femoris. Rectus femoris is right down the midline of the quadriceps here. It attaches across the knee and across the hips, making it a really key player for us getting back into hip extension. So when we position ourselves, we need to make sure that we're working on one leg at a time. So we're going to bring the foam roller all the way over to the side, and we're going to place it right in the midline here. We're going to come down and make sure that everything else is in a neutral position. So we have forearms down on the ground, we have opposite leg out, knee in contact, foot in contact with the ground, and we have a neutral spinal position here. From here, we're going to slightly bend the knee into flexion, and again, we're going to use that oscillation technique and try to find those trigger points in the tissues. So really a big key here is making sure that we don't dump the pelvis into anterior pelvic tilt. We keep active core. And then again, we just want slight flexion of the knee here. So you're going to bend the knee up slightly. What that does is actually puts the rectus femoris on a little bit more tension and allows us to find some of these acute trigger points that are going to jump right out at us. When you find one of these things, we're going to stay on those for 15 to 45 seconds and then trying to find 2 to 3 per side. Again, Dave's getting in a real good position here. He has his shoulders in neutral, his opposite leg in neutral, and his spine is nice and controlled. Yeah, so you're going to find some shit in there. So with that oscillation technique, it's smooth, slow, controlled, 1 inch, boom, on and off. So after we get done foam rolling the quads, that rectus femoris, we're going to mobilize the quads out of this half kneeling position. So this is one of those posturally dependent positions that we want to try to tap into some internal tension to try to get a quad stretch on the knee that is in contact with the pad here. But before we get going, I want to just make sure that we get you into a prime position just so we're not falling into any compensation patterns. So we want to have this front leg is going to be directly in front of the hip here. We want to be at a 90-degree bend at the knee, a 90-degree bend at the hip. We want arms down to the sides, and we also want the toes to be kicked in on the backside here. This is our base position from a half kneeling perspective. What we want to do from here is try to turn on tension one segment at a time. So we want to start worrying about the pillar complex here. We're going to start from a top-down approach. We're going to turn on the pecs, we're going to turn on the lats, and this is going to co-contract together to get the shoulders in a neutral state. The head's going to remain in neutral. And then from here, we're going to use the glutes and the adductors firing together again in co-contraction. So the legs are scissoring together, glutes are coming together, and this is going to be our base position. So if I go and I start perturbating Dave here, he should be nice and stable throughout all the planes of motion here, even if I go starting perturbate from here. When we turn on these tensions sequentially, when we go through the shoulders, then the hips, the last key that's going to turn on the tension and the stretch-based response from the quads here is bracing at the core. Once we brace 360-degree tension at the core, we should feel more of a stretch-based response here. You feeling that stretch? So from this position, we're going to maintain shoulders, hips, and core, and the hands are going to come right to the knee, maintaining that co-contraction at the shoulders. We're going to use a slow oscillation back and forth as the body thrives with movement. The last thing that we want to be doing when we're trying to enhance mobility through a stretch-based mechanism is just staying static. We want slight oscillations that are going to lubricate the joints. It's going to enhance the neuromuscular control. And again, it's just going to allow us to get a little bit better in terms of our mobility coming into hip extension here. A little bit goes a long way, so make sure that we're not dumping the pelvis as we go through this. 30 to 45 seconds, we're going to switch legs, making sure that it's high tension before we get into those positions. All right, so we foam rolled the quads. We've gotten into the half kneeling hip flexor stretch. The next key is our corrective exercise, which we're going to use the quadruped bird dog, aka the arm leg opposite. So this is the first time where we really get down into that all fours based position where our hands, our knees, and our feet are on the ground. Basically what we're going to be doing is positioning very similarly as we did in the half kneeling position. So we're going to get tension turned on through the shoulders, through the hips, through the core before we ever move. So we're going to be having ground contact, gripping the ground with the hands, trying to externally rotate and centrate the shoulders where the elbow crease is going to be shooting out forward here. So the shoulders are going to depress, they're going to get co-contracted pecs and lats. You're going to squeeze the butt, which is going to be a little bit easier to do from here. And then the last thing to do is to get into a neutral spinal position by bracing at the core. Once the shoulders, the hips, and the core are set, we're going to go arm leg opposite, trying to extend out the hand away from the foot. We're not trying to extend up. It's going to be increased distance away from each other and then coming back now down into a neutral position. So before we go into the movement, I want to make sure that we stay nice and braced here. So again, I want the pits of the elbows to rotate slightly. I want pecs and lats turned on, nice centrated position if I go and perturbate. Butt turns on, core turns on, nice neutral spinal position. So we are going to extend the left arm and the right leg and try to increase the distance away from one another and then come back to a neutral position. Perfect, and coming back. So the key here for a corrective exercise is to worry about three things: smoothness, sequencing, and stability. So when we think about this, we want to enhance the contraction quality at the top of the rep, trying to flex hard at the butt and then coming back down, trying to get the feel of these movements. Again, for corrective exercise, I don't give a shit how many reps or how many sets you do. I want you to be mindful with your movement quality here because that's what we're trying to open up in terms of quality control and range of motion. Cool. So with these, it's like a big hard flex. So like the rhythm of this will be so it's not necessarily an iso hold at the end. It's like peaking the contraction and then coming back slow and controlled. Peaking the contraction, coming back slow and controlled. And the thing about this is it's not only working the side that's extending, more so for you, for shoulder stability, for hip stability, it's working the side that remains in contact with the ground. And your hip position's good here because you're not overextending. You're thinking about almost the toe dragging on the ground as you go, so it extends this way instead of coming back up here, which is going to be the compensation pattern that you want to fall into. So the activation drill that we're going to be using for the lower body here is the double banded glute bridge. So you can see here is I have a band that's going to be placed around my knees. You can use one of the shorter, lighter ones, but just make sure that it's not too much tension where it's crushing your knees together. We want the ability for the knees to come out and externally rotate. The second band is going to be another lighter resistance band. Make sure it's circular, and we're going to hook this around the heels. So we're going to put it around the heel, we're going to pull it up around the waist, and then we're going to put it on the opposite heel. The way that we're doing this setup is just really easy for many people to do just because it doesn't take a power rack to get in and place bands around the pegs. So this is something that you can just do on the floor. If you're traveling, you can bring your bands with you. It's something that you can always use with your activation drills. So once we have the band around the knees, we have the bands around the heels that's put around the waist, we're going to get into position here. So we're going to place the toes down, the heels down, and make sure that we have constant tension at the hips. So I'm thinking about driving my knees out away from one another, but also externally rotating the hips just to get as much glute activation as possible on the pre-tension. The upper body is actually really important here too because we need to be bracing at the upper back and we have to be bracing at the spine in order to optimize, again, the contraction quality at the glutes. So at a 45-degree angle, we're going to be driving our elbows down into the ground, bracing our scaps back just like we would in a bench press, and using the irradiation effect of the hands, driving them down into the ground. So we're going to first pull the knees apart from one another, brace the core, come up, squeeze as hard as you can, and control back down, turning everything back off. The reason that we're not doing rep after rep after rep is that for a corrective exercise or for an activation drill, sequencing is very, very important. So we're bracing upper, we're bracing lower, we're bracing core, and then we're coming up through the dynamic component. You should be feeling this at the glutes. This is a glute bridge, this isn't a hamstring bridge, this isn't a calf bridge or a lower back bridge. So we're going to position your feet, making sure that you get the best contraction here. So we got Dave in position here. I want you to move your butt this way. We want to make sure that the heels aren't too wide and far apart from one another. We want a little bit more narrow of a base at the feet because then that allows us to drive the knees out to get the hips in a more centrated position. So Dave's going to have his arms at 45 degrees. He's going to drive those down into the ground using his hands, flexing the butt, flexing the core, and then raising up, flexing hard, and then coming back down. Releasing everything and going back through that sequence. Upper body turns on, butt turns on, core turns on, upper flex, and then coming back down. Again, we're thinking about doing as many reps as we can keep the quality high with. We don't want to pre-fatigue ourselves in this activation drill, but what we want to do is activate and not annihilate. Good. Where are you feeling that? Perfect. So as Dave dials in this band tension, he'll get a feel for exactly how much he needs to abduct the knees away from each other, exactly how much he needs to externally rotate. And another big thing on this is that we're not letting the pelvis drift into anterior tilt. We're pulling it back to make sure that we can get the glutes firing as hard as possible on every rep here. Perfect. This isn't a range of motion game. This is a quality game, and these are very well executed reps. For the lower body foundational movement pattern development phase of the 6-phase dynamic warm-up, we're going to be doing a superset here. So we're going to be doing the big king compound movement patterns, which are the squat and the deadlift. But we're going to be doing these a little bit differently. We're going to be using low loading. We're going to be using a kettlebell here, and we're going to be going through a goblet squat variation and then a single kettlebell dumbbell RDL from a top-down approach. We're going to go through these things one by one. So Dave has some restriction where he cannot get into the true goblet position where you're going to be up in front of the chest here. So again, we're training patterns here. We're not just training dogmatic movements. So we're going to have the same ground contact pattern, which is going to be a little bit more narrow for Dave. We're going to have him with a kettlebell that's going to be down in front of him, and he's going to be going down through the squat pattern and then coming back up with a high quality of movement. The cues that I really want you to focus in on here is being able to centrate the hips by using pre-activation and pre-tension at the lateral posterior chain, just like we were doing on the squats yesterday. So before we ever descend down into that eccentric moment in the squat, I want you to brace, and then control the descent smoothly. Good, so this will be a great way for Dave to kind of go twofold with mobility and stability work at the same time while transferring it into a big compound movement pattern that he's going to be placing an emphasis on with his max effort days, but also with his dynamic effort days with the squat here. And again, we're trying to stay smooth and sequenced with these motions and getting the best range of motion that we possibly can while keeping and maintaining a spinally neutral position and the pelvis intact. So we want to shift here, and we're going to be going into the RDL variation. So we're going to be going a little bit more narrow at the feet. It's going to be very similar to the foot position that you just used. The only difference is we're going to toe in a slight bit. We're going to come down, and we're going to be working the true, most authentic hip hinge that we can by feeding this dumbbell through to the heels with a neutral spinal position and then coming back up. A big key here is we want to ingrain the lats with the glutes and the hamstrings, really priming the entire posterior chain here. So we're going to be descending down under control, keeping a neutral spinal position, not dumping over here, and then coming back up and having a hard and heavy squeeze where we not only activate the glutes, but we bring in the adductors with it as well. 3 to 5 reps here. Good foot position. Perfect. So we're only using a range of motion that we can control. So we want to have some good distribution between the hip coming into a flexion moment and also the knee coming into a flexion moment. The squat and the hip hinge, many times we can use the same cues because they are very, very similar. They're on the same spectrum of movement pattern, but they're just differentiating between which joint, the hip or the knees, are leading the pattern. So again, we're going to go superset here, 3 to 5 reps at a time, 3 to 5 reps times through that superset, and we're gonna really just be focusing in on one key cue that you're thinking about at a time to try to enhance the quality of the movement.
What about load? Because if I use a greater weight, I'm gonna be able to go lower, obviously.
So that's the reason why we're keeping one of the lowest load dumbbells here. Okay. So we want to have something in your hands, not because we want to increase the stretch or we want to increase the mobility, but we want something in the hands so we can tap into the radiation effect and get the lats turned on more. It's very hard to turn on the lats without anything in the hand. So we're just using, I think this one's 20 pounds, just so we can kind of connect the upper body with the lower body through the core. Last phase of the dynamic warm-up sequence for the lower body, we're gonna go a little bit more joint friendly. So instead of plyos, instead of sprints, jumps, we're gonna be going through iso holds. And the one iso hold position that I wanna work on with you is gonna be the split squat stance. So we're gonna be splitting our stance and we're gonna be getting into a mid-range of motion and we're gonna be holding maximal tension in this range of motion and then coming back up and holding that for 5 to 7 seconds. What I want you to be thinking about here is not only your quads or not only your glutes, but trying to bring the anterior and posterior chain together while you're bracing maximally at the core. Really anything to gain tension we want to use. So even your hands, your shoulders, full body tension, 5 to 7 seconds, stand up, take a couple seconds, and then go on to the opposite side. Remembering that it's not only the leg that's out in front of you, but it's the leg that's behind you as well. When we set up, we want to be putting our feet at a position where if you went down into a half kneeling position that we've used previously, it's going to be at about that 90-90 position so we can get the best connection of our muscles that we possibly can. Good, 45 degrees, squeezing as hard as you can, squeeze, 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 and then coming up out. Don't rush it between sides. I want you to really get down into this motion and have as high a quality of contraction as possible. When we're thinking about tapping into the CNS, it happens with high tensile muscle contractions.
John, can you go on the other side of David?
Good, mid-range of motion, squeezing, squeeze, squeeze, and then coming up out of this. So Dave and I were talking about this previously. He's had a really great amount of success with iso holds because of the transference and range of motion and the strength and hypertrophy transference. So if we're at about a 45-degree angle here, you know, the literature says that we get about a 10 to 15-degree carryover above that range of motion and below that range of motion. So depending on what we do in the future here, we're going to be monitoring that range of motion, but we're trying to go midline in the middle here just so we can get the best transference right now.
All right, so it's been 10 weeks exactly since I was here in Columbus.
So my hiding on Instagram didn't work really well. So I posted some of the videos on Instagram. I think this is important to discuss because I think other people will run into this.